The village of Sundara was a place where time seemed to stand still. Nestled between emerald green hills and a river that sparkled like liquid silver, it was a picture of tranquility. But what truly set Sundara apart was not its beauty, it was the old woman who lived on the edge of the village. Her name was Mala, and she was a mystery to everyone. Her cottage was small and weathered, her clothes patched and faded, yet she carried herself with a grace that made her seem almost otherworldly. The villagers often saw her walking through the fields, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her face lit with a smile that never seemed to fade. Children adored her. They would run to her side as she wandered through the village, drawn by her laughter and the way she could turn the simplest things into magic. A fallen leaf became a treasure, a puddle a portal to another world. But it wasn't just the children who were captivated by Mala. The adults, too, found themselves drawn to her, though they couldn't quite explain why. What baffled them most, however, was her unshakable happiness. When a storm destroyed her garden, she simply smiled and said, "Now I have space to plant something new." When her only cow fell ill, she sang to it as she tended to its wounds, her voice soft and soothing. Even when the rains flooded her home, she laughed and called it an adventure. The villagers whispered among themselves, their curiosity growing with each passing day. How does she do it? They wondered. How can she be so happy when life keeps throwing hardships her way? One evening, a young man named Arjun decided he had to know. Arjun had always been a hard worker, but lately, life has been unkind. He had lost his job at the mill, his savings were dwindling, and his mother had fallen ill. The weight of it all had left him feeling hollow, as if the world had drained all the color from his life. He found Mala sitting outside her cottage, her hands busy weaving a basket from dried reeds. The setting sun bathed her in a golden glow, and for a moment, Arjun hesitated. But then he stepped forward, his voice trembling with a mix of desperation and hope. "Mala," he said, "how do you do it? How can you be so happy all the time? Don't you ever feel sad or angry when life is unfair?" Mala looked up, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled. She set the basket aside and patted the ground beside her. "Sit, my dear," she said gently. "Happiness is not about what happens to you. It's about how you see what happens. Would you like to hear a story?" Arjun nodded, his heart pounding with anticipation. And so, under the fading light of the sun, Mala began to weave her tale, a story that would change not just Arjun's life but the lives of everyone in Sundara. Mala's voice was soft but steady, like the gentle flow of the river that ran through the village. She began her story, and Arjun leaned in captivated by every word. "Many years ago," she said, "when I was a young woman, I had a family, a husband who loved me dearly, 2 beautiful children, and a small farm that provided just enough for us to live comfortably. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Life was simple, and every day felt like a gift." She paused, her gaze drifting to the horizon as if she could see her past unfolding there. But one year, everything changed. A terrible storm swept through Sundara. It came without warning, roaring like a beast and tearing through the village with a fury I had never seen before. The winds howled, the rain fell in sheets, and the river swelled until it overflowed its banks. Arjun's eyes widened. He had heard stories of that storm from his parents, but he had never imagined what it must have been like to live through it. Mala continued, her voice tinged with sadness. When the storm finally passed, the village was in ruins. Homes were destroyed, trees were uprooted, and the fields were flooded. Our farm was no exception. The crops we had worked so hard to grow were gone, the animals had scattered, and our little home was barely standing. My husband, ever the optimist, tried to reassure me. "We will rebuild," he said. "We still have each other." She smiled faintly as if remembering his strength. "And for a while, we did. We worked tirelessly, trying to piece our lives back together. But fate had other plans. A few weeks after the storm, my husband fell ill. At first, we thought it was just a fever, but it grew worse. We had no money for medicine, and despite our prayers, her voice broke, and she took a deep breath before continuing. He passed away. Arjun felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't imagine the pain of losing someone so dear. Mala's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. I was heartbroken. It felt as if the storm had taken not just our home but my entire world. For months, I wandered through life like a shadow, going through the motions, but feeling nothing. My children needed me, but I could barely take care of myself. I thought I would never be happy again. Mala's expression softened, and a small smile played on her lips. I was sitting by the river, lost in my grief when I noticed a little girl playing nearby. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She was building a tiny boat out of leaves and twigs, her laughter ringing out like music as she set it afloat on the water. Arjun listened intently, his curiosity piqued. Watching her, Mala continued, I realized something. Life goes on. The river keeps flowing, the sun keeps rising, and the world keeps turning. My grief hadn't changed any of that. I could either drown in my sorrow or learn to float with the current. She leaned forward, her eyes locking with Arjun's. That day, I made a promise to myself. Every morning, I would wake up and find one thing to be grateful for. Some days, it was as simple as the sun shining through my window. On other days, it was the sound of birds singing or the kindness of a neighbor. Slowly, I began to see that even in the darkest times, there is always a glimmer of light, if only we choose to look for it. Arjun frowned, still struggling to understand. But how can you be happy when something truly terrible happens? How can you find light in so much darkness? Mala nodded as if she had expected his question. It's not easy, she admitted. When the worst happens, it's okay to feel sad. Grief and pain are part of life. But even in those moments, I remind myself that nothing lasts forever, not the good times, and not the bad. This too shall pass. And when it does, I will still have the choice to find joy in what remains. She paused, her gaze returning to Arjun. But then, one day, something changed. Arjun left Mala's cottage that evening with a heart full of questions and a mind buzzing with new thoughts. He couldn't shake her words from his mind. Happiness is a choice. This too shall pass. At first, it was hard. When he woke up the next morning, his first thought was of his troubles, his lost job, his sick mother, his dwindling savings. But then he remembered Mala's advice. He forced himself to look for something, anything, to be grateful for. That day, it was the warmth of the sun on his face. The next day, it was the sound of his mother's laughter, faint but still there. Slowly, he began to notice other things, the way the villagers greeted him with smiles, the beauty of the hills at sunset, the taste of a simple meal shared with loved ones. Word of Mala's wisdom began to spread. Others in the village, inspired by Arjun's transformation, started visiting her. They, too, learned to find joy in the small things, a blooming flower, a child's laughter, a kind word from a friend. Years later, when Mala passed away, the villagers gathered to honor her memory. They planted a tree in the center of the village, its branches reaching toward the sky like a symbol of hope. And on the tree, they hung a small plaque that read, "Happiness is not a destination, but a way of traveling. Choose joy, and let it light your path. Happiness is a choice that comes from within. No matter how difficult life may seem, there is always something to be grateful for." By focusing on the good, embracing resilience, and remembering that challenges are temporary, we can find joy in every situation.